Hello there, this is John Burroughs again, and I'm going to continue with my autobiography, 7 Years to Life. This is chapter 39, and it's called The Oakland Follies. This is the ideal story to follow the previous one, although it actually happened before my marriage to Georgia. It was around, I believe, late 1968 when it did happen. Excuse me. The Vietnam War brought many people face to face with moral dilemmas, and most of us thought we would never have to make the agonizing decisions that we eventually made. You have just read about G.I. Joe's decisions and how those agonizing decisions altered his destiny, thank God, in a positive way. G.I. Joe's experience was the result of a clash between his sense of duty and his moral beliefs, and fortunately, he found out that no matter how strong one's sense of duty to their country is, if you are confronted with fighting an obviously unjust war, regardless of the original reason that the war was waged in the first place, then you follow the dictates of your soul and moral compass, no matter how people may perceive you. This is one of the most difficult decisions that human beings have to make. Like G.I. Joe, and so many other young men, of whom I was one, I was considering many options other than fighting in Vietnam. Excuse me again, I'm sorry. When I received my draft card, that essentially said I was draft eligible, I immediately scheduled an appointment to go before the board at my local selective service office. I wanted to plead that I should not be eligible for two reasons. I was a conscientious objector and a Universal Life Church minister. Anyone could be a Universal Life Church minister simply by sending them a letter as to why you wanted that distinction. I've never heard of anyone ever being denied the privilege of being one of the ministers of the church. I also had never heard of anyone's draft status being changed due to the fact that they were ministers and had written documentation from the church. I was also denied conscientious objector status because no matter how hard I tried or pleaded with the qualified people to provide me with written documentation supporting my claim, these people whose letters might have made a difference would not write them because they were well aware of my history, and if there was anything I was not, it was a conscientious objector. As far as I could tell, I had two choices left. I could go to Canada and may never be able to return, or refuse induction, and that would carry some very serious penalties, including jail. The hoodlums that I used to hang with a few years back considered jail time as a badge of honor. Though I was still confident that I could adequately handle myself in those conditions, I was living a hippie lifestyle now that, well, you know, peace and love, etc., were the cornerstones of that lifestyle. At that particular moment, I was out of options to elude going to the war, excuse me, and that did not have the repercussions I was willing to, and that did not have that did have the repercussions I was not willing to deal with. The new hope arrived with the institution of a draft lottery. It was exactly like rolling the dice, so there was still a sliver of hope, regardless of how small. I am still a little unclear about it. What I did know then was that each draft-eligible man would be assigned a number, I think it was from 1 to 300. I think if you were one of the unlucky ones who received a number less than 150, you were toast. Supposedly it was a sure thing that you would be drafted. I received a 79, and as quickly as that sliver of hope had appeared, it was buried in an instant. I knew the process would take a while, but that did little to alleviate my fear. It was not long after that I received my notice to appear in Oakland for my pre-induction physical. The purpose of the pre-induction physical was primarily to make sure that those who were going to be drafted were truly in the correct physical and mental condition to be inducted. This supposedly gave the Army a rough idea of the numbers that would be shipped out come induction physical time. I went to my pre-induction physical hoping against all odds that they would find some defect that would make me ineligible. Of course, they found nothing of the sort. I was now certifiably afraid, and Canada and French lessons began to look better. I think that I have mentioned elsewhere in this book that I was extremely lucky, had some unknown spirit watching over me, or possibly both things. I was at Jeff S.'s house one day, shortly after my pre-induction physical, and I was explaining to Jeff and his brother-in-law, Glenn S., about my thoughts, and I was still unsure of what I was going to do. Then, incredibly, luck and divine providence intervened once again on my behalf. Glenn was attending San Francisco State and told me about this place across the street called the Ecumenical House. It was a Catholic nonprofit organization that provided young men and women counseling for many of the problems that young adults were dealing with in those days. Glenn told me about a gentleman there, Dean A., who was a paralegal or rookie lawyer of some sort, and that was a subject matter in all things dealing with the draft. He suggested that I make an appointment to see Dean. I was not optimistic, but at the same time, I was left with nothing but undesirable options, so I figured it was worth the gas and the drive. I made the appointment, and what a fortuitous decision it turned out to be. The meeting with Dean actually turned out to be quite short. He looked at my paperwork and discussed the actions I had previously taken to avoid the draft. He asked me if I had already gone through a pre-induction physical, and if so, when. After I answered his question, he told me that in his experience, my notice to report for my induction physical would be forthcoming in the next 2 to 6 months. He started looking me up and down, and admittedly, this seemed odd and caused me some mild discomfort. He then asked me what I weighed, and I told him approximately 170 pounds, but this only served to make me more uncomfortable. We stood there in silence, staring at each other for a short time, until he remarked, "There is something that you can try. However, I am not sure there is enough time to pull it off." Elation began to overwhelm me, but I tempered that feeling with logic, simply because I had no idea what he had in mind. Impatiently, I blurted out, "The suspense is killing me. If there is even the slightest chance that your idea will provide a solution that is better than the remaining options I have left, then please tell me, what is it?" Dean began explaining to me that if the Vietnam War had been a formally declared war, then he would have not been able to help me. As he was reaching into his desk and began searching for a file of some sort, he said, "The Army has a matrix or chart, if you will, that in no uncertain terms says that if you are a certain age and height, you cannot be drafted if you are over a certain weight. This does not prohibit you from volunteering." He gave me a copy of the chart and showed me how to decipher it, and basically had a weight limit of 202 pounds for someone with my height and age, regardless of what I weighed at my pre-induction physical. I could not conceal my relief, and I know I looked at Dean with a shit-eating grin and whispered to him, as if talking above a whisper would make the discovery disappear, "Correct me if I'm wrong. From what you are saying, and the official Army documents that corroborate it, is that if I can gain roughly 30 pounds in the next 2 to 4 months, then I'm free." He replied matter-of-factly, "Yes." I now felt invincible, I should say, but at the same time curious, and I asked Dean Why on earth would the Army ever have a regulation such as this? Surprisingly, his answer was quite logical. He explained that up until the Vietnam War and the stigma that was attached to it, there was no shortage of volunteers. As the unpopularity of the war grew, enlistment shrank, so as you well know, they instituted the draft lottery in the hopes of coming up with the amount of personnel that they had forecasted would be needed for the duration. They could have formally declared war, but that would bring different problems that the Army did not want to deal with, and it is not important to discuss now. The fact of the matter is that they simply did not make uniforms for anyone over 6'7" or anyone, bluntly speaking, that is too fat. This does not mean they would not accommodate you if you wish to volunteer. I was in shock. This was going to be a slam dunk. My whole life I battled with overweight problems. Part was due to my metabolism, but quite frankly, when I was a young boy, my mother spoiled me, and cookies and cupcakes and candy bars were always in abundance at our apartment, and I could consume some incredibly large amounts of these fattening foods in a heartbeat. If you couple this with the fact that my best friend Eddie was my equal in every way when it came to consuming sweets. Also, the sweets that I just mentioned paled in comparison to my enjoyment of milkshakes and freezes. My willpower at times was weak, but throw in the fact that I was now a true pothead, and this made my willpower non-existent. I'm not going to lie. I was anxious to get started. This was going to be one of the easiest challenges that I ever had to face in my entire life. I'm not going to bore you or discuss you with my exploits of gluttony, but about 3 months and 3 days after I had started my quest, I received notice that my induction physical would take place in 2 weeks. When that time came, I had to be a minimum of 203 pounds. I ran into my bathroom and weighed in at 202 pounds. It was time to step up my game. I did some research and discovered, not surprisingly, that milkshakes would be my main focus due to the fact the amount of calories in a milkshake was substantially higher than anything else I had been consuming. I was drinking them already, but I nearly tripled my intake. For some reasons that I do not know of, milkshakes did not fill me up like other things, like cakes from bakeries that were known for their rich frostings. I increased my consumption of these delectable desserts. Once again, excuse me. Other than that, my diet consisted of fast foods and buffets. The day of my induction physical had arrived. I weighed myself that morning and I was at 203 pounds. That made me feel somewhat distraught because I thought that I would be a little heavier. Uncertainty began to creep in and I realized, perhaps too late, that I had been relying on my personal scale at home and I had no idea of its accuracy. Uncertainty turned to fear when I started thinking that I would be weighed on an Army scale. I did not trust the Army at that time, and I began to be delusional, thinking that the Army might tamper with their scales in order to make people appear lighter than they actually were. You have to realize that you are picked up by a military bus at your local draft board, and once you pass the induction physical, you are back on the bus to be immediately transported to Fort Ord to receive further orders after boot camp. There was no going back home. Though I was at a weight that should do the trick, I still had an uneasy feeling that by the time I stepped on the Army's scale, it was not improbable that I might weigh 202 pounds or less. The seriousness of the situation forced me to think logically and rationally, eliminating panic from my thought process. I had to gain enough weight expediently in order to guarantee the success of my plan. I looked into my refrigerator, cupboard, and pantry, and I was dismayed at how little food I actually had. However, three things caught my eye: a half of a honey-baked ham, about 8 slices of white Wonder Bread, a half-full jar of best food mayonnaise, and more salt than I could have hoped for. Instinctively and frantically, I took 6 slices of the bread and lathered each one of the slices with a healthy dose of mayonnaise. Hurrying along, I removed the Morton salt container and I liberally sprinkled salt directly from the container on top of the mayonnaise. I took the honey-baked ham from the refrigerator and laid it down on the countertop, kissing the top of it as I did. I carved the ham into 6 pretty thick slices, then placed 2 slices on top of each bottom piece of bread loaded with mayonnaise and salt. Of course, I placed the remaining 3 pieces of bread on top, creating 3 massive sandwiches. I placed the sandwiches into a brown paper bag. Then came the piece de resistance, a gallon jug of water that I loaded into a duffel bag along with the sandwiches. I was feeling much better now as I headed to the draft board and arrived there just in time to catch the bus. As soon as I found my seat, I opened the duffel bag, grabbed a sandwich, and began to eat it. I had right around an hour to complete eating the sandwiches and drinking the water. The first sandwich was done in a matter of minutes, and I washed it down with quite a bit of water. I took a deep breath, and out came the second sandwich that I started on immediately, and it took a little bit longer to finish. Then came the water, 2 deep breaths this time. The guy sitting next to me looked at me puzzled and asked why I was eating those enormous sandwiches and gulping water. I returned his gaze and said, "If I told you, you wouldn't believe me anyway." Out came the last sandwich, and it met the same fate as the previous 2, and then I polished off the water with a loud burp. In all honesty, the burp did nothing to alleviate the tremendously bloated feeling that began to overwhelm me. We finally arrived at the Oakland Induction Center, where we were herded in like sheep to begin the same physical that I had just taken about 3 months prior. Here is where I actually began to have fun. One of the very first things that happened was that after we were ordered to strip down to our skivvies, we were ordered to bend over and grab our butt cheeks as far as possible. A doctor's light was then shined up our asses, and when that was over, we were told to pull up our pants and moved on. I was told by a guy in my group that the bend over exercise was to see if anyone had a certain type of cyst that would immediately 4F a person. I began to wonder whether all the farts that I heard in that room were unintentional. I think you know the answer. As the process continued, I tried all the things I had tried at pre-induction. I told them I was homosexual, and that just made these assholes laugh. I told them I was a heroin addict, and I was told big deal, and that lots of people are. When it came time for the hearing test, I tried to fail it by just hitting the buttons randomly. Basically, you were seated at a table that had this brown box on it. On top of the box, there were 3 silver buttons, and then you were told to take the headphones that were resting on the holder and put them on. You were then instructed to listen for a sound. If you only heard it in your left ear, hit the left button. The same went for the right ear, you hit the right button. And if you heard it in both ears, you hit the middle button. I just pushed the buttons wildly, intending to fail. When the test was completed, the Army person informed me that I could not hear out of my left ear, to which I replied, "What?" He just told me to move on. It finally came to the point where your height and weight was taken before moving on to the desk, where you would receive the necessities for basic training. You would then put on your uniform and go hop on the bus ready to take you to basic training. I asked what my weight was, and I was told I was 208 pounds, 6 pounds more than necessary. He handed me the papers and pointed to the desk where I was to go. I looked at the documentation just to make sure it said 208 pounds, and it sure as hell did. I almost broke into a trot to get to that desk. It was just as Dean predicted. The guy said, "Welcome to the Army," and started to stamp my paperwork. I stopped him and said, "I do not have to legally join the Army," and I told him why. I immediately pointed my weight out to him that was on the official documentation. He sneered at me disgustedly and said, "The Army has a program for fat boys like you." I purposely looked at him in the most arrogant manner I could muster, leaned over and said, "The Army obviously does not have a program for idiots like you, because if you really knew your shit, you would know that I am in an undeclared war. The only way you get me is if I volunteer." Do you seriously think I'm going to volunteer? To this day, I know that if he had gotten away with it, he would have leaped over that desk and beat me senseless. Many people gave up their lives in that war for a country's leaders' interests that were deceitful and shameless. Others fled to Canada and eventually returned. Others found in Canada a place they could enjoy and love. Many refused induction and let fate control their destiny. The thing that will forever stick out in my mind about this war is fathers with their arms around crying mothers as their sons were taken off planes in body bags and forever gone, is the bright eyes, laughs, hugs, trials and tribulations, and future joys that could have been. I remember the public outcry that something like this can never happen again. Protect our shores and our future with voracious vigilance, and even go to war if that happens. Yet, it seems like just yesterday that I saw the Twin Towers burning, people crying in disbelief, but the terrorist groups continue to grow abroad and on our sacred ground, and not enough is being done to eradicate it. In fact, our late leadership, in the name of political correctness, appears to tolerate it. For those who have read Aristotle and those who have not, think long and hard about one of his most famous quotes. Tolerance is the last virtue of a dying society. If American society dies along with its dreams, then the words of Patrick Henry, as simple as they are, will mean more now than they were then. Give me liberty or give me death.